Too rainy as rain.
I know we had that nice bout of good weather the last couple weeks, and it looks like the tide has turned.
Yeah. What have you been doing in quarantine to keep yourself busy?
I've crazily enough, I've actually been busier than ever, which I thought I sort of expected that this time was going to be slower and quiet and more time for like reflection and contemplation, and it's actually been really, really busy.
Yeah.
So is that true for you as well?
Oh yeah. Teachers posting a bunch of homework.
Oh yeah, so they haven't let up on you guys at all, huh?
Nope, they're finally figuring out how to post everything.
And how is the online learning working? Is it all independent with things that they post, or are there actually class sessions at all, huh?
No. There is some class sessions on Microsoft Teams, but they're not
And
required.
how is the online?
What?
Oh, sorry. I stopped hearing you for a second, and I was hearing an echo of my own voice. There was a weird tech
Oh
thing
yeah,
for a
I heard
moment.
your echo too. That was weird.
Yeah, like what I'd said like 10 seconds ago.
Yeah. Classes, they're pretty good. We're using Microsoft Teams currently, and well, they're going kind of rocky, but we're working out the bugs and everything.
Good. And who are you quarantined with?
Right now it's my mom, dad, and brother, but my neighbors had to drive their parents back to Montana, so I'm here at their house dog sitting.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
So you get some puppy company.
Yes.
That's great.
Alrighty, are we ready to start?
Sure.
Alrighty, so next week meetings have been moved to Friday. It is Sarah Kneller talking about live and esports on May 6th, Miri Rodriguez, and she's talking about brand storytelling. Alrighty, and thank you to our sponsors, Media Educators for Excellence team, Advanced Broadcast Solutions, Keycode Media, Microsoft, Adobe, Micro K-12, Fidelis, Xylogics, Women in Film Seattle, Brain Buffet, Seattle Film Institute, Nifty, Washington Filmworks, Studio School Los Angeles, and Corner Cameras. Alrighty, I'm here with Jen Marlowe, and she is talking about stories that move the needle. And yeah.
Great. Well, thanks, Sydney. It's great. It's great to be here with you.
Yeah.
Do you want me just to, actually, we can go back to the slide before. I know that one of the things that you were hoping to hear from folks who were presenting was kind of how we started doing what we're doing. Do you want me to launch right into that? Or all right, great. And just definitely feel free to jump in if you have any questions or comments or anything. So yeah, I started out, I kind of came to documentary filmmaking very much through the back door. I started out actually working at Seattle Children's Theater. And then from there, I was working in Seattle, mostly Seattle middle school, several different middle schools in Seattle, using theater with middle school youth as a way for them to explore things in their own lives. They were creating original plays that then we were rehearsing with them and they were performing. So it was definitely always involved in storytelling and in the idea that storytelling was a really important way both to expose things that were going on in people's lives and as a way to address those things. Then I ended up moving to Jerusalem, where I lived for 4 years. And in those 4 years, I was working for an organization that brought Israeli and Palestinian teenagers together for dialogue-based conflict resolution. And that was actually the first time that I picked up a camera. And at that time, it was to do video messaging between the Israeli and the Palestinian youth. As the violence in that part of the world was growing worse, and the Israeli occupation was becoming more and more entrenched, particularly the freedom of movement of the Palestinian kids was which had already been limited, became even more limited. And so they were not able to travel. And some of them had things they wanted to communicate to their Israeli colleagues about what their life was like, what was happening in their areas, what the Israeli occupation, what the Israeli army was doing in their areas. But the kids themselves couldn't travel, so they invited me to come with a video camera so that they could use the camera to show their Israeli colleagues the reality that they were facing due to the Israeli government policies and due to the Israeli military. So that was actually what I started doing, which became, in some ways, my first documentary film shoots, even though I didn't recognize at the time that that's what that was. But I learned how powerful it could be, not only to bring the stories, but to bring the images, to let the images be telling the stories. And from there, that led me onto a path of documentary filmmaking. I do other forms of storytelling as well, all nonfiction, but all at the heart of thinking about how stories can be a part of these struggles for justice and for liberation. And so that's what I mean by moving the needle both in what.
Okay.
Yeah, so moving the needles of society, right? And in order to make those changes, in order to make those larger scale shifts in society, we have to start by shifting our own concepts, our own beliefs, our own understandings. And so if we can move the needle in those ways through telling these stories, that those become part of those larger shifts.
So that was kind of your biggest inspiration while becoming a filmmaker.
Certainly, it was my initial inspiration. Yeah, I was working with these high school students in Israel and Palestine, and hearing how their commitment to exposing their stories was a part of moving the needle and creating those changes. And then I wanted to think deeper about how could I go further in that direction, and how could filmmaking and storytelling be a part of larger shifts of awareness and larger shifts of consciousness.
When was this? Like, was it before or after college?
That was after college. Nothing I studied in college has anything to do with filmmaking. Everything has been like learning on the fly, learning by doing, learning by asking people who know more than me, which are a lot of people. I studied psychology in college, and
cool.
then I moved out to Seattle after that.
Cool. Okay. Next.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So yeah, there was a couple projects I thought it might be useful for me to just to show, because I like some of these concepts I know that I'm talking about can just be kind of like academic sounding, and I thought it could be useful for me to sort of talk through a couple of different projects to show a little bit more what I mean. So when I talk about doing like social justice filmmaking, for me, it's really important that everything I work on both is a part of exposing social justice issues and exposing human rights issues, but that it's connected to concrete benefits for the communities who are sharing their stories with me. For me, the idea of spreading awareness, although raising consciousness and spreading awareness is absolutely critical and very much at the heart of what I do. It's important to me that it not stop there, but that there's real solidarity with the communities who I'm partnering with to tell their stories, and that they are receiving some actual benefits. So this photo was taken from when I was filming in Gaza, which is a part of occupied Palestine. And this was right after there had been a really large war in Gaza in 2014. And in the course of the 51 days of that war between Gaza and Israel, there was over 2,000 Palestinians who were killed, as well as 72 Israelis. And out of the 2,100 Palestinians who were killed, 500 of them were children. And there was over 17,000 homes that were destroyed, and also almost 250 schools. What you're seeing there is a photo of me filming. That was actually how it used to be a clinic. And there was a neighborhood that was almost entirely reduced to rubble in Gaza City. And I was filming with some human rights activists in that neighborhood, and that was the remains of a clinic. So that's the context of, I actually wanted to show everyone a short film that I made from the filming that I did. So the filming that I did was 6 months after that war had happened. So this was 6 months after the fighting had stopped. And I went to Gaza and I filmed, but then I didn't end up creating the films till this past summer. And this past summer was the 5-year anniversary of what had happened in Gaza. And so I made this 5-part mini-series called Remembering the Gaza War, where each of these, it was 5 different segments. Each one was about 5 minutes long, each one a different story from the Gaza War. And the idea was to show that even now, 5 years later, there are still these impacts, and that it's important to remember what happened 5 years ago so that we don't let it happen again. So the video that I wanted to show all of you guys is a video segment of when I filmed in a kindergarten that had been destroyed during the Gaza war. Real quick, before we show that, it looked like you maybe had a question or wanted to say something?
I was just wondering, where were you like when that happened and when you wanted to go and film that? Were you in Seattle or were you in, I think, Jerusalem, you said?
Yeah, so I had lived in Jerusalem between the years 2000 and 2004, and then I came back to the US, and I continue to go back to Israel, Palestine. Usually I spend between 1 to 2 months a year there, although it varies year to year. So when the war itself happened, I was actually in Seattle while the war was happening.
Okay.
But then 6 months later, I went back to Palestine, Israel, and then that was when I went to Gaza, which is a part of Palestine, and filmed for what became that 5-part series.
Cool. Okay.
And do you, any other questions, or should we watch the video?
I'm ready to watch. I'm excited.
All right, let's watch it.
أنا كفاح قحمان مديرة الروضة. اشتريت المكان وأسسته في لحظة في الحرب كل فقدته. شو اسمك؟ جبريل الرحل. شرفنا. اسمك؟ القذايف الإسرائيلية والطائرات ضربتها هنا قذايف، وموجود حتى الصواريخ، بقايا صواريخ اليوم. هيك قذايف، هيك صواريخ دمرت المكان من هنا تيجي، كان من شمال القذايف هيك، والمبنى من جوا كمان كله كان أصابته قذايف يعني في الحرب. ينظروا لهذول الإنسان شو أذنبهم، يعني أجى على الروضة يعني وجدها ركام، يعني ركام إيش دخلوا، يعني الطفل هان في العمر هذا لا بيشيل زي ما بيحكوا يهود، لا بيشيل كلاشينكوف ولا بسوق طيارة ولا عنده دبابة، له كراسته يعني دفتر وهيك يعني دفتر بيكتب، طفل بيكتب يعني هذا إيش ذنبه يعني يفقد كراسته ويفقد. احنا هنا بنعلمش يعني سياسة ولا قتل ولا موت، احنا بنعلم الطفل انه يكتب، يمسك القلم. قصص المكان كله كان قصص للاطفال، هم بيلعبوا يعني. حتى الان يعني الاطفال بيبكوا وخايفين. لا احنا قعدنا في الفترة الاولى لما استقبلناهم في الروضة، قعدنا شهر كامل واحنا بنعمل لهم دعم نفسي ونودر منهم ونضيع منهم الخوف اللي كان في اثار الحرب. في بعض من الاطفال كانوا عنيفين، كان يضرب زميله ودائما يعني يتعامل بعنف، يكسر الطاولة، دائما يخبط في الفصل الدراسي. الطفل هو فقدت أخوها الطفلة، كان عندنا في الروضة من طول أطفال الروضة، كان عمره 5 سنوات. كل اللي في المنطقة هذه شردوا أثناء الحرب لأنه كانوا مستهدفين المنطقة هذه لأنها مناطق حدودية على الأطراف. كان شارد هو أمه من الحرب على دار سيدو، هناك عند دار سيدو هم شاردين، كان قاعد شاف قذيفة خست على بيتهم وهو قاعد. طفل الرضا عمره 5 سنوات، كان عندنا وإله صورة عندنا، فهو استشهد. أخته عندنا السنة الأصغر منه عندنا في الروضة. الصعوبة يعني بواجهها قلة الإمكانيات المتاحة عند الروضة، كيف بدها ترفه عن الأطفال، يلعب يحس بمتعة فيه الطفل وهو بيلعب مثلا ألوان، ألعاب فك وتركيب، حاجات يعني بتنقص إنه نعوضه من النقص اللي هو مر فيه العدوان، أو يعني نعيد نفسيته أو حيويته، يعني يكون مبسوط. فإحنا تفتقر الروضة للحاجات هذه، لأنه الروضة معتمدة على دخلها من الناس، والناس وضعها صفر. أولادي هدول أولادي أنا بحبهم، أنا تعودت عليهم من 13 سنة مع هدول الأطفال. أنا أي طفل بصيح بيجي بالجعلة، أنا أم الحنونة، يعني مش أمه في البيت وأنا أمه في الروضة، أنا أمه الثاني لازم أكون. إحنا بدنا نعيش بأمان، يحس الطفل وهو نايم إنه عايش بأمان، في روضته بأمان، في بيته بأمان. يعني استغفر الله العظيم، ليش تسووا فينا هيك؟ احنا يعني بسيطين، احلامنا بسيطة، الرغيف وإن نتعلم ونعيش حياة كريمة، هاي أهدافنا. هذا رسالتنا، يا ريت تصل لهم.
Alrighty, that was incredible. Oh my
Thank you.
God.
Actually, I'm going to put you on the spot for a moment, if I may.
Sure.
And were there? And I'd love to ask you, partly because it's connected to a point I want to make, but also partly because I'm just really interested and curious. Were there any moments of that stood out for you, or particular images or sentences that really jumped out at you?
It was two things. Mainly either she was always like, why would they do this to a kindergarten class? And then also the writing and the drawings, I felt like that hit home. And like, as in, I was always a creative kid, and that's horrible, but that was amazing filming. Wow, that was
Thank you.
incredible.
Thank you. And it's amazing to know that seeing the examples of the kids' artwork, being extracted from the rubble, their little writing books, that jumped out at you, and that was also something that you could relate to, right? Because as a kid who was creative, as a kid who was artistic, it's like you could relate to that. And that was exactly my hope. And when I talk about moving the needle, like in the US, in sort of mainstream US politics, mainstream US media, Palestinians are often portrayed as terrorists.
Yeah.
And so when I talk about moving the needle, it's like, how do we challenge that portrayal? Right? Like how do we, and so even just like an image of a child's drawing that they made, being extracted from the rubble, all of a sudden, someone who, we grew up being taught were terrorists, all of a sudden you're like, oh wait, no, that's a child.
Mm-hmm.
And that child was like the way I was as a child. I love to draw. There's no difference between me or any child I love and that child whose drawing I just saw. And so it might be a tiny shift that happens in our consciousness, a tiny shift that happens in our awareness, but from those tiny shifts,
big changes.
Exactly. So that's one of the examples I mean about when I talk about filmmaking that moves the needle. And then also when I talk about that, I want there to be concrete benefits. I felt horrible that it took me 5 years to actually edit. Like I had filmed and I had planned to make something and release it quickly, but like sometimes happened. I had all these other projects I was working on that I never, finally then this past summer when I realized it was 5 years, I was like, okay, this might be my last opportunity to get these stories out. So I have to do it now. But I also wanted to make sure that there was, like I said, concrete benefits to the communities who shared their stories. So the photos that you're seeing right here is the rebuilding of the kindergarten, which happened this fall. And it happened because after I finished the film and sent it out, a couple of donors who are supporters of my organization responded. They were so moved by the same film that you saw and by that teacher, by the kindergarten, that they asked, what does that kindergarten need now? And they still were trying to rebuild. They still hadn't rebuilt the destroyed kindergarten after 5 years. They hadn't had the money or the supplies to rebuild. So these two donors, between the two of them, and then some other fundraising that I did, that was able to have enough money in order to rebuild the school. So the first photograph, you're seeing the construction happening, and then you're seeing the teachers paint the mural.
Incredible.
And if we can go, I think the next slide then shows the kids in the, so then those are the kids, and they're holding signs like thanking the names of the donors. Those were the two donors who had contributed the money to rebuild the school. And one little detail, which I just think is lovely, is that one of the donors is a Palestinian American, and one of the donors is a Jewish American. And without even knowing each other, they came together to make sure that this kindergarten was going to get rebuilt, and that these kids would have a safe and comfortable place to learn. So that's another aspect of the work.
That's incredible.
Thank you. I'll pause for a second before I can jump into talking about the next project, but I also want to pause to see if you had any questions or comments or.
Yeah. So what brought you to like, was this kind of your main focus when you went to Jerusalem in the first place? Or was this kind of when you found out you just wanted to film it?
Well, when I first went to Jerusalem, it was to work for an organization that did peace work with Israeli and Palestinian teenagers. So I was facilitating those conversations, and I was facilitating different activities. And then that's what led me to filmmaking, like I was talking about earlier, when the kids themselves, I mean, they were like your age. They were 10th, 11th graders. You're 11th grade, right? I mean, 10th grade, right?
10th grade, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So they were, 10th, 11th graders, the high school kids that I was working with there. And when they wanted to show each other their realities, that's when I first picked up a camera to help them do that. And then I got drawn more and more into how filmmaking could be a tool of activism, and how it could really be a part of creating that change. And I see there's some questions, I think, in the chat. I'm not sure. Would you like to ask me those questions?
Sure. All right. What are some strategies that our girls can use to connect with the community they are interested in?
Excellent question, Cindy. I think to me, the most important thing I could offer about that is that if the interest is genuine and the interest is authentic, and it's not, I never look at the folks that I film with as like subjects of a film. I think of myself as a partner in trying to offer to different communities that I might have certain skills or certain platforms that might be helpful for priorities that they already have. So I think approaching a community that there's, if you have a sincere connection to a community, so approaching someone as saying, what do you need? Here's things that I can offer, and could these things be helpful? How could these things help you deliver a message that's important for you to deliver, or get something that you need for yourself or for your community? And I think if anything that is offered, whether it's in the frame of filmmaking or any other frame, if it's offered in that in the frame of solidarity, as like, let's partner together so that we can and letting the community themselves determine what the agenda is and what the needs are, as opposed to coming in from the outside and saying, well, I think it's important that you tell this story about your community, and I know how it's going to be told. And so, but coming more asking those questions rather than determining it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. All right, and then another question is, what challenges did you face editing something you shot 5 years ago?
That's a great question also. I think the biggest challenge that I wouldn't say that it was the editing itself, because I still had the material that I had, but it was trying to make sure that the material was still relevant. When there's something that's, yeah, exactly. So if something that's time sensitive, then being able to, like, especially I think in the US, we have such a short term attention span. I mean, we forget headlines that happened 2 months ago, right? Like, much less
sometimes.
Exactly. Yeah. And with like the rate that news is coming now, especially related, to COVID-19, it's like I can forget what yesterday's headlines were when. So to me, that was the biggest challenge. And that's why I realized, like, when it was this 5-year anniversary, I could use the fact that it was like an anniversary of like one of those numbers that people pay attention to. Like, oh, 5 years, that feels like a significant number. Like I could harness that exactly to get people to pay attention that they might not have 6 months before when it was 4.5 years, and they might not again. So it felt like, so that was the challenge, was after I realized I hadn't edited it right away, then when would be a time that I could do it where people might actually still care.
Just a question from me, not the chat, but how many hours of footage do you think you had to like go through when you started editing?
Oh, do you mean specifically for this one segment, or for the entire series?
Either one.
When so from the preschool segment, so what, it's about a 4.5 or like under 5-minute finished film. I probably had about 2 hours of footage that I pulled from to make that 5-minute film. There's no actual rule about that. The general rule of no, it's a great question, but like, the general rule of thumb I often talk about is trying to have about an hour of footage per minute of film. So if you're making a feature length film, like a 60-minute film, needing about 60 hours of footage to, but that's a rough rule of thumb, and every project is really different. And it's a great question, because sometimes people want, like, oh, what's the hard and fast rule for that? I will say you always want to shoot way more than you ever think you're going to need.
Yes, that's what I do too.
Yeah, so you've learned that lesson as well, huh?
Yep. Same with photography. If it even jumps out at you a little, film it, take a picture. Even if you don't use it, you'll have it.
Yep. And I'd say that, the greatest challenge in most of the film projects I have is having enough, in film we call it B-roll, right? It's the images that are, so like it's usually not that I didn't have enough material from the interviews with the main people, but it's more having all of the visual moments to tell the story. And I find myself going back through all of my shots, being like, do I have one more shot of, that expresses this, or one more shot that visually can give this message, and wishing, like, man, why didn't I film 10 times more? Or why did I stop filming this after 3 seconds? I should have held this shot for 10 seconds.
All right.
So
did you, one of the questions from the chat is, did you ever feel scared?
Yeah, so I have filmed a lot in conflict zones, both in Palestine and in other parts of the world, and I filmed in a number of places that could be considered dangerous. And sure, there's moments that that I knew that my own safety was at risk, and that's real. And I try to take when I'm going into situations that I know might be dangerous, I try to do that as safely as possible. But I also very much hold the awareness that the safety of the folks who live there is usually at far more risk than my own safety. So even when I am at some kind of risk, I'm just always just really aware that I'm choosing when to go, I'm choosing how to go, and that ultimately I can leave. Whereas the folks who I'm partnering with for their stories to be told, they don't have those choices usually.
Yeah.
And their lives are every bit as valuable as my life, and they're at far more risk than I'm at. So that's most of the time my perspective on that question, that even if I am taking some kind of risk, I still have far more protections than the folks who I'm filming with, and I'm not any more important than they are.
Yeah. Another thing that jumped out to me that I just kind of realized while we were talking is that I also work with kids every week with robotics and stuff like that. So
Oh, cool.
talk like about why did the kindergarten school get blown, you know what I mean? Like that also jumped out to me a lot because a teaching career is something that I would also be interested in.
So you could imagine yourself being in that teacher's
Absolutely.
position, like wanting to protect your students, loving your students, and ultimately like not having been able to protect them.
Especially kindergarten, that would be the grade I'd probably go into.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
early
so
child.
that
Oh,
really
that's
jumped out
amazing.
too.
So it sounds like you were both able to relate to like the kids through the drawings and like when seeing the remnants of their creativity, but then also to the adult caretakers and teachers.
I think what
Oh,
also made it so amazing is that it kind of had a bunch of different parts that you could connect to. Like not only just the drawings, but the teacher and the kids not having enough toys and like stimulation. You know what I mean? Like I feel like everybody could relate to at least one part of that, which was amazing.
thank you. And I was trying to show that. I mean, what you're drawing out is also like, so film is a visual medium, right? So I was trying to show, so the teacher's talking about how like the kids don't have toys, we don't have supplies, we don't have materials. And I don't know if you remember the image that was happening. Do you happen to remember what was the image that was happening while the teacher was saying that? And it's okay if you don't remember.
I do. I'm pretty sure I do. They were in this kind of like shelter building with all the rubble in the background, and they were just kind of walking around and playing. I think it was sand, something like that.
They were
They were
playing with the sand.
Yep. They weren't really doing anything. They were just kind of sitting and playing with sand.
Yeah, and they were playing with the rubble. There was a
Yes.
moment, they were building towers. They were making, so rather than taking blocks and building tower with toy blocks, they were building towers with the rubble.
Yeah, I remember that too. Yeah.
And so it was both, to me, that image, that was the image actually when I shot that image, that was the image that stayed in my brain, for 5 years. Like the image of these kids building towers from the rubble of their own destroyed school. And to me, that image both illustrated the impact of war, right, and the impact of the fact that these kids didn't have the resources, that the families didn't have the resources for the school to have supplies, and the destruction of war. But it also, to me, said something about the resilience of childhood, right? Like they were still kids, they were still playing. If they didn't have blocks, they found things to play with, even the rubble from their own destroyed school.
And she was also. Oh, go ahead.
No, please, you.
And the teacher was also talking about how the psychological trauma that they had gone through when one of their students died, and she was talking about how the kids kind of lashed out a lot and broke different things. I thought that was very like hard hitting too, because I think that's
Did that match anything that you have learned about trauma and how kids respond in trauma, or what about that felt powerful to you?
I feel like it's almost something that doesn't get talked about a lot, like kids in those kind of worlds that's happening. Like we don't really hear a lot about their trauma, and how they've reacted to it. So I think that was really important to add to kind of both to more understand and emotionally connect with the kids too.
Yeah. And I think it's a universal thing of like kids, of how kids respond to trauma, and when a kid, like, you're probably, you might be going into education yourself, right? And so when a kid is acting out, what's happening, what's going on in that kid's life. And in this case, it was it's a big, huge, stark trauma, but for kids in the school system in North Bend, there's kids that are dealing with stuff in their homes or in their communities, and it comes out, right, in their behavior.
Alrighty, a question from the chat. How do you deal with fairness and showing a balanced view, or do you want your films to have a point of view? Do you go into a project with a point of view, or does it come during filming?
Oh, that's a really great question. I will say that I think those are in some ways different but related questions. First of all, I will say that I do come in with a point of view. My point of view might evolve during the course of filming, and it usually does evolve, and I hope it does evolve, because what I discover when I'm filming should, impact my point of view. But I'm coming in as an activist, as a human rights activist, and as a social justice activist. So I'm coming into a situation where I feel like there's been injustice, and with an agenda to try to use my filming or my writing to expose that injustice. And so I don't ever try to hide that. I don't try to disguise that. I think what's dangerous, what I would call the difference between what I do and what I would call propaganda, is I think propaganda is when people are trying to hide the fact that they're coming in with a perspective, and they're trying to say that, oh, this is the whole story, or this is the only truth, or, and mask that, like, that there is a point of view. I think there's a very big difference between honesty and balance. So the first part of the question about showing balance, I don't try to show balance. I don't strive to show balance because in many cases the situation itself is not balanced. So if I were to try, like, it's very, but there's a difference between striving to be truthful versus striving to be balanced. I always strive to be truthful, and I always strive to be honest in my storytelling. But that's not the same as showing balance. So, for example, if I were to have shown, like, there's one child in the film you just saw who was killed from that kindergarten, the little boy named Mohammed. During the 51-day Gaza war, there was also a 6-year-old Israeli child who was killed. His name was Daniel. And when Daniel was killed, and I saw the photos of him on Facebook, and I saw the things being written about him, it broke my heart. It broke my heart that this absolutely innocent little Israeli child was killed. And he was killed by a rocket that came from Gaza. If I had been trying to show a balanced film, right, I would have shown the story of Muhammad with the story of Daniel. And then that would have been balanced. It would have shown the pain of the loss of this Palestinian child and the pain of loss of this Israeli child. In trying to portray that balance, though, I think I would have actually been committing an injustice and a dishonesty, because Muhammad was one of, I think it was 491 Palestinian children who were killed. So almost 500 Palestinian killed in those 51 days. Daniel was the only Israeli child who was killed.
Wow.
That doesn't make the tragedy for Daniel and his family any less. I'm not, by pointing out that statistic, I in no way am trying to diminish the absolute tragedy of the loss of that little boy's life. And there's no justification, I believe, for any kind of violence in which a child could be targeted and could be killed. But I would have been presenting a skewed reality, right? The reality is that there was a massive imbalance of the civilian toll of that conflict. And if I had tried to portray balance, I would have been dishonestly portraying the imbalance of that situation. So that's where I come from when I talk about trying to the difference between balance and honesty. And the difference between and thinking and believing it's very possible to come in with a point of view, and as long as you acknowledge that point of view, you can still do that honestly.
Yeah, I the chat doesn't have any questions, and I don't. Do you want to go to the next slide?
Sure. So this is a slide of it. So this is a different project, because I just thought it might be useful to have like a couple examples of and this project is kind of complicated to describe, so I'll do my best to do it succinctly. So I Am Troy Davis is about, so the man, I'll start with describing who is the man and who is that little boy that you see in that photo. The man in the photo was a friend of mine whose name was Troy Davis. And the little boy was his nephew, Dejan, who at the time that photo was taken, I think Dejan was probably about 5 years old at the time that photo was taken. And you can see, what you can tell by the photo is how happy they are to be with each other, the joy. I mean, you can see that, Dejan is beaming, Troy is beaming. By looking at that photo, is there anything else? I'm going to put you on the spot again, Sydney. Is there anything else that you can tell, or that you feel, that any other pieces of that story that photo tells you? Do you have any sense of where they are, or any other details?
The wall kind of reminds me of I don't know, it's a brick wall. I'm not 100% sure where they are, and I'm not sure what Dejan, is that how I pronounce it?
Yeah, good job.
I'm not sure what he's looking at, but they look incredibly happy, and they look like they're being like silly and playing around or something. I'm not 100% sure where they are though.
Which is totally fine. Where they are is Dejan is visiting his uncle Troy on death row in Georgia.
Oh, wow.
Troy was an innocent man who was on Georgia's death row. And he was ultimately executed, despite the fact that there was a mountain of evidence that pointed towards his innocence. The state of Georgia proceeded with his execution, and there was a huge international. This was September 21st, 2011, when he was killed, and there had been a huge international movement protesting and trying to stop this execution. I ended up partnering with Troy and with his family, and my closest partner in this was Dejan's mother, Martina, and who was Troy's older sister, and wrote a book with Martina and with Troy, and the book is called I Am Troy Davis, and the book was telling the story of from their family's perspective. Again, did I have a point of view? Absolutely.
That sounds like a good book.
I hope you'll read it. It's called I Am Troy Davis.
I will. Wow.
So the book was published in 2013, 2 years after Troy was killed. And then a script was developed. A man named Philip Montgomery wrote a screenplay based on the book. And I was trying to think about, well, what can we do with the screenplay with the script that was written that could be impactful and could be effective? I'm absolutely against the death penalty. One of my goals in writing the book was that Troy's story and the family story be a part of exposing why I believe the death penalty is a huge human rights violation.
Absolutely, yeah.
And also, the other thing I was really interested in thinking about is how could we show that the death penalty is a human rights violation, but it's not one that's just like off on its own. It's actually connected to other human rights violations that we perpetrate in this country. So I think the whole criminal justice system is filled with human rights violations. I think the mass incarceration that we have in this is a human rights crisis in this country. So how can we show that the death penalty is connected to these other aspects of the criminal justice system? And then also how all of that is connected to larger systems of state violence that happen in this country. For example, police killings, right? We're seeing all the time police killing unarmed and innocent folks, primarily Black and brown folks. How can we show that the injustice of the death penalty is connected to these other injustices? So my collaborators and I had an idea that we could produce a performance of the script from I Am Troy Davis, but the performers would not be actors. They would be people who themselves were directly impacted by the death penalty, and they would be impacted by other forms of state violence and other forms of racist violence. So I'll just really quickly go through who some of the performers were. because then some of the performers, so the person who performed the part of Troy, his name is Cephas Johnson. Cephas is the uncle of Oscar Grant. Some folks, this is aspiring filmmakers, I encourage people to watch the film Fruitvale Station if you have not seen it yet. That was a film made about Oscar Grant's story. Oscar was a young Black man who was killed in the San Francisco Bay Area, Oakland actually, by the transit police. He was taking the subway. The BART is the Bay Area Rapid Transit, and on New Year's Day in 2009, the transit police handcuffed him and then essentially killed him when he was already handcuffed. So his uncle, Oscar's uncle, played the part of Troy. The part of Troy's sister, Martina, was played by a woman named Erica Gordon Taylor. Erica Gordon Taylor was the cousin to Emmett Till. Some folks might remember the story of Emmett Till. He's the 14-year-old boy who was lynched in Mississippi in 1955 for whistling. He was a Black boy, and he whistled allegedly at a white woman. And two men dragged him out of his home one night and brutally murdered him.
Wow.
And the murder of Emmett Till is actually one of the things that launched the civil rights movement. So Emmett's cousin ended up played the part of Martina in our performance. Dejan, who you're seeing that photo of, the younger Dejan was played by someone who had been exonerated from death row. So someone who had been on death row, slated to be executed, and then finally evidence about that person's innocence came out, and he was released from death row. And then the teenage Dejan, we had a different person play the teenage Dejan, and that was another former death row prisoner who had been exonerated. So these were all folks who were impacted directly. The woman who played Troy and Martina's mother, her name was Gwen Carr. She is the mother of Eric Garner. And I don't know if you remember the case of Eric Garner. He's the man who was killed by a chokehold by the New York City police in Staten Island, saying 11 times, "I can't breathe." So if you've heard that slogan, "I can't breathe," connected to the Black Lives Matter movement, that came from Eric Garner, saying 11 times, "I can't breathe," as he ultimately was choked to death by the New York City. This was in the summer of 2014.
I did not hear about that, but that is.
So the video clip that I want to show next. So we filmed the performance, and we filmed all the rehearsals, and we filmed all the conversations that happened. And now we're making a documentary film that goes back and forth between the performance of Troy's story, but then also the stories of all these performers, because we're trying to show how all of this is connected. So this clip is during one of our rehearsals, and it captured Gwen Carr, who's the mother of Eric Garner, who was choked to death saying 11 times, "I can't breathe." So she's talking about the connections that she saw.
And just like you and the others that was on death row, you all were there waiting to be executed. My son was on the street and got executed. So they was the judge, the jury, and the executor right there on the street. And he was innocent, just as innocent as you were. And he didn't even stand a chance, just like so many hundreds of thousands of other people. So this is what I think about the story also, that it brings out to me, that we are victims as Troy Davis was, but just in a different way, So we need to think about that.
I really appreciate that, connecting that state violence, right? It's all state violence, whether it's inside or outside.
Right, that's right.
So anyway, that's just a very small clip, and that film, we're in the middle of making that film. It's not, but we're trying to, just like when Carr talked about those connections, that's part of the purpose of that. And then this was the whole group, this was the whole team, including Troy's family, Troy Davis's family, all came from Georgia to New York for the performance. So this was a group photograph of all of us after that performance.
That's awesome.
And
So you guys are filming this in New York?
So yeah, we filmed the performance in New York. That happened in December, and we filmed all the rehearsals and conversations. So now we're editing the film, and we're actually also continuing. So it was just going to be the one performance, but the whole group decided that they wanted this project to continue.
Awesome, yeah.
And so we were actually supposed to be going to Austin, Texas tomorrow, to do a performance in Texas, but then with everything happening with COVID, that's
COVID-19.
postponed. But we're still working with the group, thinking about what other actions they want to do as a collective.
That's amazing. Do you guys have some sort of Instagram or something like that for the whole team?
Yeah, so Donkey Saddle Projects is the organization, and so donkeysaddle.org is the website, Donkey Saddle Project's Facebook page, and then and actually on our website, donkeysaddle.org, there's a video of the entire performance of that entire event. And then Instagram at donkeysaddle.org, and also Twitter at donkeysaddle.org. And I think there might be a few more chat questions.
Alrighty. So what filming techniques do you use to get this type of footage?
I'm not sure if that question came specifically about the clip with Gwen Carr. I wasn't the one filming. I'm producing the film around the I Am Troy Davis project, but I wasn't the cinematographer. So I won't talk about that clip in specific. I did film myself, though, the clip of the film from the kindergarten. Basically, filming techniques, I try to always think about, first of all, when I'm filming an interview, to film the shot where it's thinking about, framing the shot where the person is like, sort of, I'll try to frame the shot. Not, where it's I don't know if you know the rule of thirds, if you kind of draw the graph so that you have the person, close up sort of over to the side. So I try to use the rule of thirds when framing interview shots. But then the most important thing I think is to get as much B-roll as possible.
Yeah.
And to think about a variety of different kinds of B-roll shots, but also thinking about how can you get long shots, medium shots, close-up shots, and film as much variety in your B-roll as possible, so that then when you're editing, you have all of the options to choose from.
Yeah. All right. And then also, what were your 3 takeaways in becoming a filmmaker?
That question is from someone named Sarah Berger. Great question, yes. Sarah Berger. And I have to think about what are my 3 takeaways in becoming a filmmaker. I might have more than I don't know that I could say the 3 without having thought about that in advance, but I can talk about 3 of the takeaways.
Yeah.
And there might be more than 3. I think one, and these might even be repeating some of the things that we've already talked about, but I would say that one is that I think the belief that I've always had that people's stories matter deeply, and that people telling their stories is an absolutely critical part of social justice work and of human rights work, because every individual story is connected to an individual human life, and it's only when we lift up the value of every single human life as being equally important and equally valuable that I think we can start making the right kinds of choices when it comes to social justice questions.
Yeah.
So the belief, so I've always had that belief, but I think the longer I've done this work, the more that belief is confirmed. I think a second takeaway I would say is that that an approach where you're really approaching folks to work in partnership with them, to tell the stories, to amplify the stories that they feel are important, and that they identify as being what's most meaningful, rather than coming in with an outside agenda, I think is something I think that is really, really important. And so the importance of that is another takeaway. And let me see if I can think of a third takeaway, because Sarah asked for 3.
The magic 3.
Yeah, I mean, and I think like anything else, like for me, I'm motivated by human rights and social justice, and wanting my work to be a part of furthering those causes, but it's also a craft, right? So wanting to try to hone my craft more and more. And I will never say like, oh, I know this craft. I'm still learning, you're still learning. I can learn by looking at your work. Hopefully you can learn by looking at my work. So so continuing to try to hone your craft and get better and better at the artistry of it, at the same time as caring deeply about the subject matter that you're working on.
Yeah.
Both are important.
All right, we have another, I think. How do you install confidence in people that they can talk to you honestly on camera and you will not distort what they say?
That is a really great question. And I think that it happens a lot that journalists or filmmakers, sometimes accidentally and sometimes on purpose, do and sometimes distort what people say, right? Like and or take one segment of a much longer thought and taking that segment out of context, then changes what the whole meaning is. So the first way I try to instill that confidence is I try really hard not to do that, right? I try really hard to make sure that I am honoring the essence of someone's story and honoring the essence of their experience. Obviously, I'm making choices when I'm editing. If I edit a 3-hour interview, I might only be using 5 minutes of that interview, but but trying to really make sure that that essence is there. I also try to make sure that I spend time with folks before, like that I'm not, for me, the filmmaking and the relationship building go hand in hand. So I don't just parachute in and film and then parachute out. Like I try to make sure that folks have the opportunity to get to know me and trust me as a person, and that they trust that I genuinely care about them. And that's and I think one of the questions that was earlier, that I was talking about is like, that care has to then be genuine, right? Like you can't make up genuinely caring about someone. So it has to be genuine, and then you have to spend enough time with folks that they can feel it's genuine. I also always let folks see a copy of what I'm creating before it's released to the public, and some filmmakers will say never do that, and some journalists will say never do that. I understand why not to, but I also feel like ethically it's really important that people get a chance to say, no, I don't, please take that part out. Like that doesn't represent me.
I totally agree with that. All right. Alrighty, we're gonna finish off with thank you so much. That was
Thank
amazing.
you, Sydney. You're an amazing interviewer.
Thank you. That was amazing and totally inspiring. Very inspired by what you do. And then do we want to put up, all right. So thank you again to our sponsors, Media Educators for Excellence, Advanced Broadcast Solutions, Key Code Media, Microsoft, Adobe, Micro K-12, Fidelis, Xylogics, Women in Film Seattle, Brain Buffet, Seattle Film Institute, Nifty, Washington Filmworks, Studio School Los Angeles, and Corner Cameras. And then again next week, Will Lynn, The Heroine's Journey. And it's going to be Friday, April 24th at 11. So thank you.
Thanks, Sydney. It was great to chat with you.
Thank you too. That was amazing, and I'm very inspired by everything you do.
Can't wait to check out your work also.
I'm gonna be updating my Instagram even more. It only has a couple pieces of my artwork, but yeah.
I'm excited to check it out.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
You too. Alrighty.